listening to The Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Jonelle Elgoway.
Good evening and welcome to the Doctor's Corner on Ka 360 Network. I'm your co-host Jonelle Elgoway and we are here with Dr. Kline. Welcome, Dr. Kline.
Good evening.
Good evening. If you have a question tonight for Dr. Kline or our special guest, please call in at 415-915-2291. You can also chat live with our audience on YouTube channel Conspiracies Against Wellness live stream. And now I'd like to welcome special guest Kira to the Doctor's Corner. Kira, how are you this evening?
Hi, I'm good. How are you doing?
Great, thank you. Tonight we're going to focus on the topic of addiction. Last week we discussed the 3 different types of addiction, A, B, and C. Dr. Kline, what would you like to start off with this evening?
Well, we titled this show Dr. Kline and the Dope Fiend. And although that's kind of tongue-in-cheek, obviously, it's not really a slap. It's really the truth. And what we're going to introduce tonight is a new diagnosis that's in our country. And it's called fear of addiction phobia. Now, FOA, phobia, in my mind, is a real disease. Here's the definition of phobia from the dictionary. A persistent, irrational fear of an activity or situation that leads to a compelling desire to avoid it. So if you think carefully about what's going on, everything that's going on is based on a fear of addiction. It's a FOA, phobia. So the term dope fiend came from the 1930s when people were portraying people with addiction disease as losing control, so that people became afraid of addiction. People aren't afraid of diabetes, and that's really a parallel disease. So what's the difference? The difference is, like Franklin Roosevelt said, the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. Is the fear of addiction rational? Absolutely not. I mean, that's the whole point of the diagnosis of a phobia. So as a doctor, I am making the diagnosis of a new kind of phobia in the general population, and that's fear of addiction. If you go to, is it Pinterest, that website where they have posters and stuff? Mm-hmm. If you plug in Dope Fiend, you'll get the old posters from the movies. This all started, as we've talked before, with Reefer Madness that was actually produced by the government. And what this did is it instilled fear of addiction. The movie was actually about marijuana, but they used the word dope. Then dope gets mixed up with everything else. Why? Because the people doing the critical thinking are suffering from fear of addiction, phobia, and they can't think straight. So how many people in the audience know of a person with addiction disease? Now, before we mention the word addiction disease, we've got to go into a quick digression, and I've discovered in talking to other people, this is very, very important. I was just on a website, the psychiatric website, looking up addiction, substance use disorder. It's got 11 different things. And what it is, it's a mixture of the different kinds of substance abuse that we talked about last week. This is no different than talking about diabetes and trying to make generalities with the concept of diabetes, high blood sugar, when in fact there are 2 main types: children with diabetes and adults with diabetes. They are very, very different diseases. So if you have in your mind diabetes and you start making lists, you're going to be wrong. The same thing has occurred with addiction. Addiction A is by choice It's people who go and take a lot of substance to feel better, may have disrupted lives, may have been, this is what you hear about, with abuse and blah, blah, blah. But it involves drugs that do not cause a physical addiction. That is marijuana, cocaine, dextroamphetamines, and alcohol to an extent. Those are the main drugs in Group A, addiction type A. People can stop. There's no withdrawal. There are frequently screwed up lives, and so this is when rehab really works. Addiction B is the junkie. And I say junkie because most people who have addiction B call themselves junkies. Would you agree with that, Kira, or am I off base?
I would refer to myself as one, yeah.
Okay. I was talking to one fellow, and he said, the guy almost died, and thank God he was there with an experienced junkie. So, but junkie kind of helps keep it into type B addiction. Type B addiction is clearly a brain disease. There's claims made for type A that there are some abnormalities in the brain. That's true, but there's no commonality. In Group B, there is commonality. Every single person with opiate addiction or junkie or type B addiction has the same MO. And when we doctors start to see the same MO, then we think, hey, this is a disease, not a condition. So type A is more condition. They're still addicted. Type B, they're addicted, but it's biochemical addiction. Most people do not seek out type B. They become accidentally triggered, maybe when they're type A and fooling around with drugs in high school and stuff like that. So very important to keep these two things separate because the treatments are different, the biology is different, everything is different.
Can you have a type A and B addiction or no? It has to be one or the other.
I was wondering the same.
Yes, you can. In other words, a person, let's say, who starts IV cocaine, right? And they're shooting up, and they've never had an opiate before, right? Never. That's the rule. So all of a sudden, they just take a Vicodin. All of a sudden, they're on cloud nine. They're having a celestial carpet ride, higher than the highs that you were getting from your cocaine. So that's an accidental triggering of addiction. So yes, it can start out as a B and then start out as addiction A and end up as a B. And some, type B addicts like to smoke dope and have cocaine mixed in. But the predominant disease is the opiate addiction. And my definition of addiction is pretty close to the Psychiatric Association. They say compulsive substance use despite harmful consequences. In mine goes one step further. It's intense seeking of substance without regard for consequences. So what we need to do is we need to talk to people with addiction B. And that's why we've invited a dope fiend on tonight, tongue in cheek. She's not really a dope fiend, but that's the way people think of it. So we want to have Kira tell us a little bit. And one of the things that's very irritating to me as a physician are all these states running around with FOA, fear of addiction, and it's driving their behavior. Why don't we just limit the prescription to 7 days? That'll stop the addiction. No, it won't. Where did they get that idea? Then they all copy from one another. It's like the kids in school, can I see your paper? So one of the questions that I'm going to ask Kira that I've asked a lot of other people with addiction B, and here's another term. I wrote this last year. We can also call type B addiction chemical receptor disease, CRD, because we know for sure that this is a abnormality of the brain opioid, and that's a proper term, opioid receptors. So this is not a disease of choice, and people come from all backgrounds. So with the 5-day limit, the 3-day limit, should we have a 3-day limit or a 7-day limit? And these legislators all sit around suffering from FOA, not being rational, not asking doctors. And so they pass these laws and they all sit around patting each other on the back because they're afraid of addiction. But, and we're going to ask Kira this, how long did it take to become addicted, and how old were you? Can you tell us what that first experience was like?
Well, I started off just drinking and smoking pot with my friends. And I knew right away, I mean, I had a good childhood. Like, I mean, I had all of my needs were met, you know. It wasn't that bad, but I always felt like something, like I didn't fit in or didn't belong with a lot of people, and I just kind of wanted to escape reality. So when I found weed, it was just like, okay, now I feel happy. Like I feel like I'm not, you know, stuck in my miserable reality that I'm living in. So for me, it became like an everyday thing right away because I wanted to escape my reality.
How old were you, Kira?
About 16.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so
what happened next?
Yeah.
My mom actually threw me in rehab, and that's where I learned about heroin. Yeah.
Okay. And had you tried any opiates prior to that time?
No.
Okay,
but I found it when I got out.
Okay, so when you got out, it was your very first exposure to opiates.
Yeah, the universe just kind of, it's what I wanted to find, and I ended up finding it, you know, and that was when everything just went downhill from there.
So what was it like with your very first opiate or heroin experience?
Well, that's what I can explain. It's like a warm, fuzzy hug. I mean, my thought always was, if so many people are dying from this, there must be something really, really good about it to make everybody use it, even if it's killing people, you know, and that was like my logic about it. Right. So when I first tried it and I realized like, oh, this is what everybody's talking about. Like this, I feel nothing but happiness, just numb. I'm like, weed kind of just mood lift, you know, kind of made you in a better mood, but heroin completely numbed it. And I didn't know anything about overdosing. You know, I always was like a garbage can. I would just do whatever drugs that were around. Once I found heroin, I stopped doing all other drugs, and it became strictly heroin. I ended up overdosing, and the people I was with left me for dead at my friend's house. And if my mom didn't wake up in the middle of the night and put me down as a runaway, because I think I was 16 or 17, they found me, and they gave me 4 shots of Narcan, and I didn't wake up. I was in the hospital for a couple of days, and when I came out of the coma or my unconsciousness, whatever, I ended up getting thrown back in rehab. So for me, it was just like instantly bad stuff started happening within like the first 3 months maybe of using it.
So how effective was the rehab after you were on heroin?
I wasn't ready to get clean. It wasn't effective at all. I got unsuccessful discharge, and then I had to go to a halfway house, and I was there forever. And when I turned 18, I signed myself out and started getting high again.
So the high that we hear from people with addiction B or chemical receptor disease has been described by a lot of people as pretty intense. Would you say, is that a fair descriptor, intense?
Yes, definitely.
How about with marijuana or speed or cocaine? Do you feel the highs, and maybe based on other people's experience too, or as intense as the experience with heroin or diamorphine? I like diamorphine. That's its real name. So do you think those, the high?
It's like no, I think opiates are kind of its own category. Like there's nothing that ever made me lose everything and like just completely be obsessed with it like heroin. You know, coke didn't do that, weed didn't do that. You know, it wasn't like throw my life away for it, you know.
So intense seeking.
Yes.
I use the example of or trying to, are there other situations in life that intense seeking comes about? And I use the analogy of a bunch of people living up in Alaska in little individual homes in a community, maybe 12 homes. And there is a shortage of fresh water. Pumps don't pump all the time, so a couple houses will get water, a couple won't. So the people that don't get water after 48 hours will start to intensively seek water. So that's kind of a little bit of a parallel. It's not the same thing. And there is also a childhood disease called Prader-Willi, in which the children intensely seek food to satisfy the food receptors. So, and would you agree with the second part of the definition, which was supplied, by the way, by another person with chemical receptor disease? And he said, without regard for consequences. You think that's
definitely
appropriate? Okay. But if you were back on weed and cocaine and amphetamines, do you think that definition would fit? Intense seeking without regard for consequences.
For me personally, no. Like I said, you know, even back in the day, it was just kind of like I would do whatever, but it wasn't, you know, I mean, yeah, I was young, so I was defiant, you know, I was just trying to like make my mom mad or whatever and just have fun. But I feel like it wasn't as bad as it was with heroin, where I just completely did not care. You know, like I'd walk out of a store knowing security's following me when I'm stealing, you know, like that type of thing.
Right.
Like it's different.
So here's the $1,000 question. In Canada, if you were to have come to my office as a heroin addict, I could offer you treatment with various opiates. What would it take? What kind of relationship would it take with the doctor, and what kind of questions would you have for the doctor to accept a controlled opiate treatment?
What kind of opiate treatment are you talking? Like a methadone, Suboxone?
Yeah, methadone, Suboxone, and you know, actually, those are sanctioned by the U.S. Drug Police. You can use any opiate. You know, you just give the amount that takes away the craving, makes you feel normal, makes you feel good, and then you have to agree to putting the kibosh on it and say, well, you know, if I have to take 8 a day, fine, but I'm not going to take 16, and go back to that amazing high. Would you?
Well, I mean,
would you go for it? In other words, you're 17 years old, and you know your life's kind of awful, but you're having a really good time with the heroin, like people have a good time with weed, but even more of a good time with the opiate, because you've got a disease. Now, here's the, you know, in other words, what would it take to go to treatment? I asked one other person with chemical receptor disease, and I said, if I could supply you with a physician assistant who could give you your medicines and take care of your health care, and he was at a voluntary halfway house, I said, what percentage of people do you think would go for this? And he said maybe 25 to 30%. Would you agree with that, Kira, or is it just too wonderful? Just the hell with it, you know, and just leave me alone.
You know, I think that's hard to say, because personally, like if I'm still 17 and I'm still doing heroin and they're going to put me in a rehab and give me opiates, like, sure, why not? You know, it's the same thing, you know? So I guess it really kind of depends. I mean, now I'd be like, no, I mean, it's the same thing, you know? Why are you going to take them off opiate, or why are you going to take them off heroin with pain meds when you still have to detox off that the same? You know, the sickness is the same.
Yep. Now, when people quit smoking cigarettes, which is also a type B addiction, we call it type B2. It's a little mini opiate addiction. People go through withdrawal. They have unpleasant behaviors like trying to find cigarette butts in public ashtrays and things like that. So they kind of have intense seeking on a smaller scale. But when people quit smoking, they go through a withdrawal that's pretty nasty. And it takes about 6 months or so to really stop wanting to whip into the 7-Eleven and buy more cigarettes. So maybe 4 to 6 months. But you kind of have a lifelong craving. You know, people kind of think, oh, gee, it'd be nice. You know, they're at a party or something, but they usually don't because it's a mini. Now, if a person goes clean off diamorphine or heavy-duty opiates, they're going to go through a withdrawal. Everybody does who takes opiates, whether you're a pain patient or not. But how long do you think it takes to really get the cravings under control? Or at least tolerable?
It all depends. I mean, if you are just dry and you're not trying to change your thinking, it could never go away. You know, if you're just always upset and angry and always want that escape, you know, for me, it took probably around the 2-year mark. Once I was clean for about 2 years, I think the cravings kind of started going away because I was learning new ways to cope. You know, I didn't have to go run and get high. I can talk to a friend now. You know, I can go and hug my kids. You know, I had different coping skills now. So if somebody isn't trying to change their actual thinking and their way that they're living, who knows how long it could take. I know people that have cravings, you know, for a really long time, and it just doesn't go away because they're not trying to better themselves.
Okay. That's interesting. I've heard that from 2 other people with type B addiction. 2 years. Right on the money. So maybe it's the brain trying to cope with this disease, and that it just takes that long, just like it takes a few months with nicotine, it takes 24 months with opiates. Now, during that time, I would think, and in talking to other people, you're kind of at a higher risk until you get to that 2-year point. Is that true or not true?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I had to stop talking to all my using friends my first 2 years. I couldn't talk to anyone. I couldn't go to old spots, nothing like that.
Okay. That's kind of like the cigarette smoker that stays away from bars. You know, I mean, because that's a very, you know, highly rewarding place to smoke cigarettes, and people do it all the time. So the big issue is whether or not to use any kind of replacement opiates. One of the things that people with FOA, phobia, fear of addiction phobia, oh my God, don't treat addicts with more opiates. And that's a fair statement, I think. And a lot of people that I talk to would rather not use any kind of replacement. But what if during that first 2 years when you're at high risk, and I know the risk out of rehab is 90%, if you used a controlled amount of an opiate, doesn't matter what, but in a controlled fashion, do you think that would be helpful if you could control it?
Well, I mean, I got clean with methadone, but I can't control any opiates. So for me, no. I mean, I got clean with methadone, but, you know, when it comes to like pain meds and stuff, my brain doesn't know the difference between a pill or a bag of heroin. It just knows that it's getting that happy feeling, and then the cravings start for heroin. Yeah.
So the methadone did not give you the high. Is that correct?
I mean, I didn't feel like I was high, but I was definitely asleep all the time.
Oh, okay.
All the time.
Okay, so you were getting a little too much. Sounds like.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm sure, and even on a low dose, like at 20 milligrams, I was just always asleep. It just always made me so tired, and I don't really know. Like, someone looking at me probably thinks that I look high, but I didn't like feel high. I just was so tired all the time.
Okay,
I had
all
no
right.
energy.
I've heard that this is what it's like for people who do not have type B addiction, who really have type A addiction. And I know one fellow that was taking heroin, IV heroin, because he couldn't find any pain meds for his bad back. And I said to him, "What was it like?" He said, "I don't know. It just made me drowsy." So in other words, he didn't have the gene. He wasn't going to get high. And maybe for you, the methadone really did that. And that goes back to an ancient premise that we have in medicine. Everybody is different. The government trying to have two drugs, for addiction. Well, not addiction. It's more biochemical replacement, I think, if you do it in the proper amount. But really, you can use any of them, and people need to go through them. Obviously, you were too drowsy. They should either, tried something low or, a lower dose or something else. Now, I think the concern with people with addiction B is that any opiate that you're given is going to lead to disaster. And it sounds like maybe that was your philosophy too. So that's a difficult problem. And you see, with all the billions spent, nobody really tries to figure out these things. They are coming up with injectables now, injectable opiates that'll give you kind of the same level all the time. There's patches now. They have, believe it or not, buprenorphine patch that lasts a whole week.
Wow.
I've talked to people with addiction disease who, like you, they guts it through, and then other people who's got on something, and they said it's kind of like somebody has replaced my void. And they're not getting high. They're just happy with the fact they can get their lives back together. In a controlled fashion, undefined, but let's say controlled fashion. So I don't know. See, I'm trying to learn too, because I think the failing of doctors is I don't know how many doctors have talked to people with receptor disease, or type B addiction. No, it's. Did you feel like you were an untouchable?
When I was on methadone or heroin?
Well, no, when you're on heroin.
Oh, yeah. Xanax and heroin both make you feel invincible.
Yeah.
Jean from YouTube asked, does an addict always have a celestial experience every time they use?
Do they have a what?
A celestial experience. So every time you used whatever drug it was, did you
We're
always...
using that instead of high.
Yeah.
So high is fine.
Did you always get a super...
No, it gets to a point where your tolerance gets so high that you're not even getting high anymore. You're just staying not sick. Yeah, so it gets to a point where it's, you don't even get high. That's the whole messed up part. You're just trying to be normal.
What doesn't work when it comes to rehab or dealing with addiction that they are currently using?
What doesn't work when it comes to addiction? It's kind of different for everyone. For me, meetings didn't work. I can't sit in a room and talk about war stories and getting high the whole time and how bad our lives were. That's stuff I want to keep in my past. I needed to live my life like drugs didn't exist. I didn't want to keep hanging out with, I just feel like there's so many new people coming in that would just keep relapsing or would come high, and it's just stuff I didn't want to see. I got a lot out of the program, but meetings just weren't for me, and I know a lot of other people that meetings are not for, but I know other people that swear by it. So it's really different for each person.
There's actually a big debate about rehab, and it was brought to the forefront by an author by the name of Maya Salowitz, who wrote a book called The Empty Brain. And she described, at least in my view, a very intense type A addicted person. She tried cocaine, It was just down the list. And, she was shooting cocaine 40 times a day. Now that's addiction. I mean, you can't argue that's not being addicted. But she could stop. Mm-hmm. And these folks tend to respond to rehab because many of the type A addiction folks are trying to take care of some problem with drugs. In your case, you started out as an A, but you quickly switched over to type B. And was your continued use of heroin really to solve some inner problem, or was it just your brain?
What do you mean with inner problem?
In other words, let's say the person, I had a good example of somebody I saw on YouTube. He was smoking weed every day for 2 years. Turns out he was gay and he had this strict Christian family. He was just hiding a problem with his marijuana. But I get the impression, and maybe I'm wrong, that folks that end up as type B opiate addicted people are just working off the brain intense searching rather than saying, my life's crappy, so I'll just go shoot up again.
I think I'm a little bit of both. Like I said in the beginning, I've always felt like something was like I didn't fit in all the way. Like I was just different from other people. And I felt like the drug world didn't make me feel different. We all just wanted to get high and we all fit in fine, But at the same time, there is something that I felt was wrong with my brain, or else I wouldn't be doing what I was doing.
Can you describe a little bit more what it was like? Now, teenagers tend to sometimes feel empty and left out. And by the way, if you want to read Maya's book, it's called The Unbroken Brain. Get it on Amazon for $14. And that's the way she felt. She felt like she was not fitting in, that she wasn't attractive, that something was deep down inside wrong with her. Mm-hmm. So I'm beginning to wonder, and this is just wonder at this point, whether people with chemical receptor disease that are going to end up being type B addicts, unless they avoid opiates forever, that there may be something else that's missing that you're putting back with these drugs. Maybe something's wrong with the reward system in your brain, because that's where the center of the genetic malformation is. And that maybe, I've heard some type B addicted people say they felt like they had this void. And as teenagers, I mean, that's a disastrous thing to feel like you have a void. Well, that means that you don't feel like you're a real participant in the social circles and stuff. And so Maya did the same thing. She started smoking weed with a friend of hers in order to feel like she belonged. But was she really treating some kind of deficit? Now, I don't think she ended up as a type B, because she tried heroin and it sounds like she didn't have too much of a problem with it. But I don't know. So we're just kind of speculating. So, you're a bright person. You came from a normal family. And teenagers, they all go out and smoke weed, drink and stuff. And I don't know how many teenagers really have a positive image of themselves, But do you think there was something else?
Exactly. Something
else other than just the normal teenage insecurities?
I think a lot of mine was just anger. I think my mom had 7 brothers and sisters, and they basically ran wild after my grandpa died. And so my mom was extremely strict with me. So, when I'm the only one that's not allowed to go out, or I'm the only one that has to be home at 9 o'clock, or, all that stuff just made me so angry and resentful. And I felt like the friends that I did have, I was missing out on stuff, and I wasn't as close with them because my mom would make me come home or wouldn't let me go out because she didn't know their parents. And I just felt like it just turned into a lot of anger.
Okay. That's a kind of typical teenage thing. So maybe we can postulate, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you started out as a type A, addicted person, looking for whatever by trying various medicines and stuff, medications or illicit medications. And all of these things are medicines now, even cocaine and amphetamines. And then you got accidentally, do you think, triggered for your type B opiate addiction?
Yeah, I have no idea. It was just like, in rehab, they just kept telling me, oh, if you like drinking, you'll love heroin. They just like kept hyping it up. And,
oh, God.
Like I said, if these people, like there was one girl who, she had herpes. She was a prostitute. She was living in abandoned buildings, getting gang raped and kidnapped. And she was just like, oh, I can't wait to get out of here and go get high. And I'm just like, oh my God, your life sucks. And you still want to go and get high. Like, this must be really fucking good,
Yeah.
And it was just, the only thing I could think of was her words in my head,
Yeah, that's it's kind of like, when people are locked up in prison, for having a little cocaine or something, they learn how to become criminals, real fast.
Exactly. Oh my God. Exactly.
Fastest way to learn how to become a street junkie, is to hang out with a bunch of junkies. And it's interesting, Kara. Go ahead.
Well, you know what's worse though is you have to think about these people that get hurt playing sports, athletes, get in a car accident, get hurt on their bike. They're prescribed pain pills. They're not even messing around with drugs, and then their addiction starts there. And people don't even think about that. Like, I know people that were never into drugs. They had great families, great jobs. They had their whole life together, and then they got prescribed pain meds for something. And next thing you know, they're shooting heroin in an alley, selling their body, and I've seen it because they lose their insurance and they can't get their pain meds, or it gets too expensive and they realize that heroin is the same as Oxycontin, so they can just get that for $10 on the street instead of paying whatever they pay for their pills, and that's how they start theirs. And it's really scary because especially, you can't avoid getting hurt. If it happens, it happens. And you don't know if you're an A or a B, so you don't know if it's going to take you down that road or not.
Yeah, good point. What our current thinking is that 90% of addiction occurs in teenage years, which it did for you, and that's because this is when people are first exposed. See, that's why we need more information from folks like you. That first exposure, it's not creating an addiction like in addiction A. It's actually triggering an addiction. So this is why on the very first pills, and this is holding up for more as I talk to people, the people remember back, it was the first Vicodin tablet. It was the first drink. Some people, drinks will trigger an opiate addiction. So in schools, what happens is it's accidental, just kind of like it was for you. In other words, kids go to these parties, and there's alcohol, and there's antidepressants, and there's just pills all over the place, which is pretty typical here in Raleigh. You're talking to high school students. So, oh, wow, this weed's wonderful, and all of a sudden the kid with the jeans happens to get a Vicodin tablet, and he's off in the corner going, oh, my God, I'm going to the moon. Well, none of the other kids are saying that when they're taking opiates. They may try to pretend like that when they're smoking weed or some cocaine or something. But this kid's different. This kid is on what we call a celestial carpet ride or another going to the moon or something you can help us think of. Because this is what kids need to know. They need to know that when you feel like that, it's abnormal. And all the other kids won't feel like that when they're taking opiates. Type B. See, it's important to separate these two. Because, somebody is snorting a little cocaine. Wow, I feel good. But not like the kid in the corner who's taking his first Vicodin tablet. So if that's the case, doctors need to ask, have you ever had an opiate? And if they say no, you say, okay, you have a chance of becoming a type B addict, a junkie. But it's only going to occur rarely. It's only 4 per 1,000 or 1 in 250 that are carrying the gene. But still, that's like warning somebody about diabetes or any other drug. It may be rare, but that doesn't matter. So what I'm thinking is that we need to have people like yourself explain This happens immediately. It's got nothing to do with the 7-day rule that the FOA, the phobic people, are passing. It has to do with understanding that this disease is triggered. And it's not your fault. Maybe somebody smokes weed all day and doesn't work and is a bum and ruins all his relationships or her relationships. I mean, maybe you could level that criticism against them. And you need to go to rehab to straighten out your life. But a type B, one guy I talked to said when he was 14, he had a couple of beers, and 3 days later, he was looking for whiskey. And he ended up on the streets for decades, So there's a cross trigger, too. That happens with, we mentioned before, with Mormons and Muslims who don't drink. So they may be 30 years old before they've had either. They won't have alcohol. And then they're 30 and they go to the emergency room. And lo and behold, they go, hey, wow, this pill is unbelievable. I want more of these. And again, the doctor in the emergency room could say, have you ever had an opiate? And if the answer is yes, and has not triggered an addiction, that person will never, ever addict.
We're going to take
a... sound here? Go ahead.
We have a caller from area code 209. Welcome to the Doctor's Corner. What's your question?
Hi, it's Ariane.
Hi, Ariane.
I was calling in on a couple fronts. The first one being, as far as the addiction issues with opioids go, even breaking it down by type A and B, we kind of realize when we start breaking it down that this is a very complex issue. And it, like we've kind of seen and discussed in the past, it has a lot of comorbidities, if you will, as far as biosocial and psychological factors that come into play. Even with the people who have the mu receptor disorder, a lot of the time, from my experience growing up in a community with a lot of people who became addicted to drugs and alcohol, it was kind of hit or miss sometimes. The thing is that what I see happening in regard to addiction is that a small percentage, yes, are there a small percentage of people who get an opioid, like the football player that Kira mentioned, and take the magic carpet ride and go, I want more, or end up on heroin? Yes. And I think we've determined that that's probably 1% or less of people without a history of substance use issue, other than if they have alcoholism, I know the percentage goes up, and other drug use. But it's about 1% or less. If you haven't taken any drugs, you just get a prescription, then you become addicted. What we're doing with this opioid hysteria is actually counterproductive in addressing those types of situations, as well as people who come in with legitimate issues and drug seeking as far as the substance abuse line, because we've destroyed the doctor-patient relationship so severely that people don't feel comfortable telling the truth to a doctor anymore because they know that their confidentiality is no longer there. Yep. That they're going to end up, put into some drug database with an OUD diagnosis. Mental health and law enforcement has access to their records. So we're actually kind of, in the effort to stem ODs and address opioid addiction, everything we're doing is counterproductive to that, first of all. It seems, to me anyway.
Well, and this is what we're talking about in the beginning. This is fear of addiction is driving these behaviors on the part of people who are not addicted.
Mm-hmm.
But your observations are, very good. Yeah, go ahead.
The second issue you brought up was people with addiction issues having this compulsion. And I was doing some research. I have a family member who has a drug and alcohol problem. And I was kind of doing some research on my own about the whole deal. And I ran across some articles, and I hate rat studies applied to humans. But there was a rat study done. And what they found was that rats exposed to alcohol, who became alcoholic rats, had a brain, an organic brain disorder that actually prevented uptake of certain endorphins on the GABA receptors. And I don't know if it was a GABA receptor issue or some other biochemical issue that was going on. But they introduced to these same rat populations kava, which is a plant used primarily in Polynesian tea drinking to produce a sedation and a relaxation. But that kava actually acts on the receptor, the GABA receptor, and it actually had a pronounced effect on the rats who had developed alcoholism in preventing them from craving alcohol.
One of the problems with that is that's a created addiction. And you see, what we're trying to do by separating the two into two groups is that addiction A is created, addiction B is not. Addiction B is triggered. So in other words, the biochemistry is already there, and it's abnormal genetically, and there's going to be a genetic test soon. So the research is kind of looking at, why is the receptor acting this way when it gets opiates? Why are people going to the moon? So it's kind of a similar thing, and it does start in rats. Most of all of our research starts in rats. So
well, it worries me a little bit about the... It does worry me a little bit. I'm sorry to talk over you. We have a little bit of a delay,
right.
But with the testing for the mu receptor disorder, and what I'm concerned about is that it will further kind of profile individuals. I can see it being a benefit in where a doctor can look at the patient and say, you know, if I give you opiates, the chance of addiction is higher. But I also see a possibility, given the hysterical climate that we're in, that it's used more as a profiling tool to deny people proper medication.
Well, people are being profiled right now just because they take opiates. In other words, a lot of people
I'm
take opiates.
raising my hand.
You're raising your hand, you know, and we just hear this every day, that they all figure they're going to end up like Kira, you know, with a severe heroin problem. But, you know, the only way we can deal with this is first recognize that there is a fear of addiction phobia out there, and that this drives the behavior. And when you have phobias, what are you going to do? You're just going to let them run wild? I mean, you have to start somewhere. So we're starting by explaining that a lot of the confusion is because they're using the same critical thinking for two different diseases.
Well, I do know Kira did mention recovery, too, and that at a certain point she wasn't ready. And with my own family member, it's the same situation. I mean, they've been close to death a couple times with delirium tremors, with alcohol and street drugs, you know, actually prescribed drugs that are still out on the street. And it's kind of a situation where at one point they're like, I want to go into rehab. And the process, actually months down the road, they're still not having access. All the money we're dumping into PDMPs and you know, steering committees at Stanford about how to teach mindfulness to people in pain. All that money is being wasted. Yeah,
absolutely.
No, and it should all...
Yeah, we're gonna have to cut it short, but you've made very important points, and also it's making the point that we really need to think of this as two different diseases, and also we need to think of the fact that people have choices. You know, when I treat I remember treating a young woman. She had a 2-year-old. She had a terrible lymphoma. Lymphomas are very treatable. And she didn't want to be treated, and she died. And that was her prerogative, you know, and it's sad for me as a doctor, but it's none of my business, you know, and if people want to go out and smoke weed or whatever, it's none of my business. I'm a doctor. And if law enforcement...
Right, and you're not a mind reader.
And I'm not a mind reader, so, you know, but we have to educate people. We have to say, hey, if you've never had an opiate, you're going to have a chance, and you've got to call me immediately if this happens, because then we could stop all this. At least the addiction B. But thanks for calling.
All right. Well,
and
thank you for all your advocacy, Dr. Kline. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Arian. So, Dr. Kline, and Kira, if you had education early on about this, if your parent came to you and said, "Hey, you know what? I want you to learn about this, and if this happens and you take this at a party, and you feel a certain way, would you please let me know?" Would have you done that or no?
Well, I mean, I did. Me and my mom did have the talk, but it was more like drugs kill you type talk. But I talk to my kids that way. Like, I try to explain to them, like my stepdaughter was like, "Oh, I don't understand why people do drugs." Well, they're trying to escape the reality. Drugs make you feel good. That's why people do them. They make you feel so good that you do not care about any of the consequences that go along with your life, and that's kind of what, luckily, she's seen her mom with her addiction issues, and she's seen me. I've been clean since the very beginning, almost 7 years. It'll be January. It'll be 7 years. So she's seen my life. She's seen her mom's using life, and she understands how far down it can take you. But that's the way that I go at it with my kids. Like, I want them to understand that there is a difference, between drugs, like you were saying, opiates is really, there's a difference between them, between weed and heroin, or weed and Vicodins and pain pills,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good point. And so we need to push this one step further. One thing that will stimulate teenagers into behaviors that we as non-teenagers feel is inappropriate is to lie to them. And this happened in sex education. They were all vague, and nobody was telling teenagers that, what, this is a lot of fun, and it's great. And, if teenagers knew that it was okay to have intense sexual feelings, they probably would have been more amenable to saying, all right, a little birth control, and okay, I'll be careful about, disease and stuff like that. But as soon as you lie to them, then they want to just go out and do it. So, the education has to be from people like Kira who say, this is what it was like. It was wonderful. But if a doctor had told me that was basically the first symptom of a potentially fatal disease, and I understood that, then maybe I would have agreed the next day to go in and see the doctor. And I think physicians should tell people, if you feel like this tomorrow after your first pill, you call me. It's an emergency. And we want to get into the office, and we want to set up a treatment plan. And believe it or not, because Jonelle brought this up last week, there are no treatment plans because this country suffers from fear of addiction phobia. So they spend all the money on more police instead of figuring out how we can do this. 90% of addiction starts in the teenage years. Come on, folks. Where's the early intervention? Where's the public health movies, the film strips? Okay, gang, this is what it's really like, I mean, when you smoke weed, you're going to feel good. You're not fib to them, don't do drugs. That's, you're not going to get anywhere doing that. And then the parents understand, and the parents can say, look, you're going to go out and you're going to do this. But let me tell you something. If you really go to the moon on an opiate, because it's only opiates will really take you to the moon. Then you need to let us know, because you've got an emergency on your hands, and we've got a disease just like diabetes that we need to jump on and treat. Does addiction run in your family, Kira? In your natural family or genetic family?
No, not my mom, my dad, or my sister. Mm-mm.
Okay. It doesn't have to. It tends to run. There's a very strong association for families. The studies show what's called an odds ratio of 7, which is basically a very high correlation between families. And it involves alcohol addiction. And currently, our thinking is that addiction C is the true brain receptor alcohol. And this is a person that may not be drunk all the time. This is a person who needs some alcohol at all times to avoid going into DTs. See the parallel with opiate addiction, but not with addiction A. None of those drugs have any kind of withdrawal. They do have their own biochemistry, but it's not the same as the biochemistry in chemical receptor disease.
Dr. Kline, we have a question on YouTube. They want to know, how would you treat addiction B disease, or how do you treat it?
I think addiction B disease should be choice. Rehabs are not regulated in the United States. It's $1,000 a day, and they do whatever they want. In Maya Salowitz's book, The Broken Brain, she brings up this issue. People should be offered alternatives. You say, okay, here's the way the disease works. What would you like to do? Here's the options. We can have controlled administration, controlled prescription administration of opiates. We can go with the buddy system, which I like, which is you're tied into a good friend or buddy 24/7 with your cell phone. We can have you do a lot of exercising. That helps jack up your endorphins. But when you're getting ready for a relapse, you and your buddy need to come to us right away. And then we'll figure out what to do. And you can then have more choices. A person with addiction B could say, all right, I just can't stand it. I feel empty. I've got to have some medicine. So we do what we did in 1915. We gave morphine to people with addiction disease, and then we were all arrested. The doctors were hauled off to prison for treating addiction disease. And so they said, you know what, we're not going to do this anymore. So then heroin started. So we're having the same thing now. We're being hauled off to prison, exact same thing. But instead, we should be sitting down and saying, okay, you can have controlled opiates, you can go bare, and you can go with a buddy system, you can have tough love, you can have, AA. Here's the things that you choose from. And what we found out, and I learned in Maya's book, was that you just go to these rehab facilities and they're like prisons. And they've got their own method they use because none of them are regulated. You don't have to get a license. You got to get a license for a nursing home or a daycare center, but not for treating addiction. And so choices, I think, for people is the best way.
We have one more caller, a caller from area code 757. Welcome to the Doctor's Corner. What's your question?
Hi, yes. I actually suffer from chronic pain from a disease called adhesive arachnoiditis. And I am currently on a high dose of opiates to stabilize my pain. What about patients who have actually suffered from addiction to opiates in the past, but now have to rely on opiates just to get out of bed? How is that handled?
Well, if it's a true addiction B, some people have had friends give them their medicine. The bottle never stays in the room. And they actually have machines that'll spit out a pill or two on a schedule, and you can buy those. But we need more thinking along these lines. People with addiction disease who have pain need to be treated, but understanding the disease and understanding that we're just going to take care of the pain. And unfortunately, you're not going to be able to get high. I mean, that's the price of the treatment, and if you want to get high and double your dose, then that becomes drug abuse. Taking just enough to keep your equilibrium is not drug abuse. And by the way, we don't use abuse in medicine. That's a judgmental word. People use too much or people use a lot. But yeah, there are ways, and we need to work on those, and that doesn't cost that much money. But, the money is pouring into the local police departments and through the DEA and through the, all the other things going on because of fear of addiction, phobia. Kira, I would like to ask you one last thing before we go off the air. Is there one thing that you would like people to understand about yourself as a chemical receptor disease addict?
I mean, for myself, since I haven't gotten high in so long, I would say more in general is don't judge and don't put people down, because you never know. Like I said, All it takes is one car accident. All it takes is falling off your bike. You know, if you have that, if your brain is set up for addiction, you could be next. So don't judge anybody, because karma always comes around, and you might be the next person that ends up in the doctor's office trying to get more drugs.
Okay, good point. And if physicians were more upfront with people and told people that who've not had any exposure before, the key thing, based on my research now of 1 year and 1,500 papers, I have not yet documented a case of type B addiction for somebody already on opiates. So people who have to take opiates, it doesn't matter if you're taking high dose, it doesn't matter what drug you're taking, powerful, weak, it doesn't matter. If you have not got the genes and you have never been triggered and you take your opiates without being triggered, you're going to be okay. But as you point out, Kira, if you go to the emergency room and you're 16, you've never had any opiates before, okay, you got a chance. And you need to know what the chance is. Doctors tell people all the time, I'm going to give you this medicine and it could cause your bone marrow to crap out, and, and we'll have to do some bone marrow transplants. Okay, doc. But then they always give the patient the choice. And so wouldn't it be nice if we said, look, you've got a 1 in 250 chance. Here's what happens. You call me in the morning. It's up to you. Do you want to take this chance or not? If people are afraid, FOA, phobia, if they are afraid of opiates, then don't take them.
Mm-hmm.
But
I'm
running
around
but running around
I'm terrified now.
Yeah, well, that's your choice, and that's fine. But see, if you worked in an emergency room and that was your personal choice, it wouldn't be fair for you to say to people, no opiates for you, because I have a fear of addiction for you. I'm afraid you're going to become addicted. Well, come on, let's handle that side effect like we handle side effects of all drugs. There are no drugs without side effects. None. So, it's all part of our job as doctors to balance the pan. You want pain relief, you got a 1 in 250 chance of becoming addicted if you've never had an opiate before, and give people the straight skinny. I mean, that's the way we do things as doctors, but it's changed because of fear of addiction, phobia.
All right, well, we're going to wrap up here. Dr. Kline or Kira, did you have anything you would like to add before we get going here?
Nope. I just need to, it's time for my donut.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I appreciate it. And thank you, Con Nation, for joining us on another Tuesday evening at the Doctor's Corner. I'm Jonelle Elgaway, signing off for the evening. Have a good night.
Good night.
You've been listening to The Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Jonelle Elgaway. Copyright 2018 by EXG LLC. All rights reserved.